Arizona State University and Science are recognizing researchers who address pressing problems. The ASU Science Prize for Transformational Impact honors early career scientists developing innovative solutions to today's biggest challenges. Hear from the inaugural winners on ASU's Lab Coat Optional podcast and visit science.org/ASU to apply. This podcast is supported by the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai, an international leader in research, education, and patient care. The school is the academic arm of the 7-hospital Mount Sinai Health System in New York City. It is consistently ranked among the top recipients of NIH funding. What are researchers in genomic medicine working on to transform patient care and improve patient health? Find out in a special supplement to Science Magazine prepared by the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai in partnership with Science. Visit our website at www.science.org and search for Frontiers of Medical Research-Genomic Medicine. The Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai. We find a way. This is a Science Podcast for August 13th, 2026. I'm Sarah Crespi. First this week, a roundup of science policy news with Science Insider editor Jocelyn Kaiser, including new grant cancellations by NIH and what's next for proposed OMB funding rules. After that, I talk with researcher Jordan Houry about testing a way to protect astronauts from solar storms and deep space radiation. This week, we're catching up with science policy editor Jocelyn Kaiser. As usual, there is a ton happening with the U.S. science funding agencies under the Trump administration. Jocelyn, you've been following stories for the past month about new grant cancellations out of NIH, the first at Emory and now at Pitt. This is after the courts basically told the NIH it could not cancel grants that had already been approved just because NIH's priorities have changed. How is NIH justifying cutting off funds again to people who've already had their funding approved?
Yeah, so what NIH is saying in the letters to or notices to the investigators whose grants are canceled is that they do not align with the NIH director's priorities that he laid out last August. He described some very specific things he wants from health disparities grants in particular from that kind of research. He says that the things that the investigators are measuring have to be scientifically valid, measurable variables, and that they have to study things that are going to lead to some sort of solution. They can't just observe a problem.
How is this different than these more than 1,000 of grants that were canceled and then that was overturned by courts last year?
With those cancellations, they were done very quickly. In some cases, according to documents that were part of that court case, within just minutes, the acting NIH director would decide to cancel grants. So NIH wasn't looking at them closely. They were just using some sort of screening to find grants that touched on diversity, health disparities, and just sending out cancellation notices. The difference now is that NIH has these priorities that the director has laid out, and when it cancels these grants, it is getting into details about why NIH is canceling them. And so possibly this is going to stand up legally in a way that the cancellations more than a year ago did not.
In the past, if someone says, oh, your grant has been flagged, it has something problematic in it, there's been some kind of negotiation process where you can alter at least how you're framing the study to kind of comply. Is that no longer on offer here?
Yeah, so it's kind of strange, but we've seen documents, or documents have been shared with Science that show that in some cases, these grants were flagged many months ago, and the program officers, that's the people in NIH who kind of oversee the science in these grants, were told that we are not going to let the investigator renegotiate it. In at least one case at Pittsburgh, the changes had already been agreed upon by the program officer, and yet NIH decided they could not renegotiate.
Looking at the way these cancellations were rolled out, there is a lot of effort being put into canceling these grants. How are they going to formalize this? Or is there going to be a way that they're going to make this a more regularized thing? Or is there also possibly going to be legislation against canceling grants? What's going to happen next with this?
So we don't really know what NIH's plan is, but we did see a letter from the director, Jay Bhattacharya, where he says, we are now canceling grants to get our portfolio in line with my priorities. So we're expecting to see more, but don't really know if this is just sort of testing the waters legally and if there will be more. And we also don't know if Congress in upcoming spending bills, appropriations bills, will put a stop to it.
Is there any recourse for those researchers? Would they have to sue the federal government to get their grants back, and would their university support them in that?
That is what happened last year. A bunch of states and some professional organizations filed lawsuits, which resulted in a court ruling that restored, well, prevented NIH from canceling more grants, and the ones they had canceled were restored. Something like that could happen, but they would need the support of their institutions because the grants technically go to your university, not to the individual investigator. We'll just have to see what happens with that, whether their institutions want to take its position when they don't want to draw attention to themselves right now because the Trump administration has done many things to try to block research overall going to grants going to universities and tried to force them to change policies and admissions and all that.
The fiscal year for NIH is ending at the end of September, at the end of this month, and they were supposed to have spent their budget. How on target is that spending? I know that there's been a lot of slowdowns in grant making and in spending. Are they going to actually spend all that money?
Yeah, so it's something like 38 billion that goes to extramural research, which is what the people who get those grants are really worried about. And the NIH director has been saying over and over that they will spend the budget. And around late June, when we last wrote about this, it looked like NIH was starting to catch up with at least last year's spending. And last year they were behind where they usually are at that point in the fiscal year, but they caught up somehow with staff working overtime. And so the story we wrote suggested that, yeah, maybe they are going to catch up again because they caught up with last year. But, remains to be seen.
Even if they do spend all the money, it's on way fewer grants. So that has an impact on universities, that maybe had smaller grants, not multi-year grants, stuff like that.
So the problem there is that their NIH has kind of a mandate from the White House to fund more of its extramural budget as multi-year awards, meaning in the past, usually you have a 5-year grant, but each year you get that year's payment. And the White House is pushing NIH to fund these multi-year grants in a single lump sum, and that means that they can't fund as many. That is probably going to result in fewer grants being funded overall, maybe nearly 3,000 fewer grants. That means fewer researchers getting their grant, and it means labs are going to be under a lot of stress, and some may have to shut down.
Last time we talked, a lot of our time was spent on this new set of rules that were released for comment by the White House Office of Management and Budget, OMB. One of the intent of this rules is to put political appointees in charge of which projects get funded, as opposed to, the peer review that we've seen in the past. The general rule has been this is scientists deciding on what science should go forward. So now the comment period is closed on these OMB rules. Many thousands of comments came in. So what happens now? Do we know if they're going to be approved? I know there's some moves in the Senate.
Yeah, so the rule has received at least 60,000 comments, possibly many more. There's some sort of glitch with how the comments are counted that suggested that 500,000 had come in. That number's probably wrong, but it's still 60,000 is a lot of comments, and the government has to go through all those comments and respond to them. And so there's a thought that even though they wanted to finalize this rule by October 1st, they probably won't be able to because of just the volume of comments. And then just over the weekend, the Senate Appropriations Committee, which funds government agencies, passed a bill that is temporarily funding the government through the end of the calendar year. And it has a provision in it that would block the White House Office of Management and Budget from moving forward with the rule. And that bill still has to go through the House, which doesn't have that provision in its version of the bill. Chances are it's going to stay in only until December, but it does mean the chances are good that the final spending bills will also block OMB from doing this.
It's August. The midterms are in November. Is there anything that we're particularly paying attention to? Is there anything that might get pushed through quickly? Or is there anything that maybe would be a big change after that election?
Well, the main thing that I think the scientific community is, and many other people are looking for, is to see if the House or Senate flip from Republican to Democratic. And if that happens, the chances are really going to go up that things like that language in the appropriations bill blocking the OMB rule, that you'll see more language like that blocking all sorts of things that this administration has done or wants to do to scientific research agencies.
Thanks, Jocelyn. Really appreciate you keeping us up to date on all of this.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
Jocelyn Kaiser is the editor for Science Insider, our policy news section. You can read all their coverage at science.org/scienceinsider.
This episode is brought to you by Perfect Bistro Cat Food. Cats, this ad is for you. Has your human ever called you picky, persnickety, choosy? If so, Perfect Bistro Cat Food is for you. With ingredients like wild-caught tuna and pasture-raised lamb, tantalizing textures, and delectable flavors that meet even the most discerning cat standards. You're not picky, you're just perfectionists. Perfect Bistro, mealtime perfection for every cat. Have your human visit perfectbistro.com.
Hear that? That's now Crispy and McCrispy strips meeting Creamy Caesar sauce. Sounds extra crispy. Caesar sauce at McDonald's for a limited time. Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Also out on the site this week, we have an investigative story in our news section. This is by Charlie Pillar and Jenny Smith. Their investigation really cast doubt on genes that have been hailed for warding off Alzheimer's disease. Mutations in Colombian families have been raising hopes for treatments, but altered patient data and suspect images are calling the benefits of looking into these mutations into question. For the commentary section, we have a review by Barbara J. King of the book Life on the Octopus Farm: The Ethics and Future of Growing the World's Most Intelligent Invertebrate by Richard Swide. In her review, King writes, through visits to aquaculture sites in Japan, Mexico, and Spain, the author highlights a potential role for farmed octopus in ameliorating global food security. There are a lot of ethical concerns surrounding this, not least the fact that octopus are very intelligent. Very interesting debate outlined in this article. Okay, from the journals, I'm just going to mention that Science Robotics is running a month-long series on humanoid robots. Definitely worth checking out. Okay, back to the main show. We're going to hear about a vest that can protect astronauts from cosmic rays in space. Earlier this year, we saw astronauts loop around the moon on Artemis 2. You might remember. We actually had reporter Ailey Dolgett on the show talking about some concerns about radiation exposure, because once people leave low Earth orbit and the protection of the Earth's magnetosphere, they're more vulnerable to accelerated particles from the sun and to cosmic radiation. If we want to spend a lot of time out past the moon, like going to Mars, real thought needs to be given to protecting crews from cancer and radiation sickness. This week, Jordan Horry and colleagues wrote in Science Advances about testing protective vests for astronauts on board the uncrewed mission, Artemis 1, back in winter 2022. Hi, Jordan. Welcome to the Science Podcast.
Hi, Sarah. Thanks for having me on.
Sure. I'm just going to eliminate the obvious solution. We can't just put a bunch of shielding all over our spacecraft and happily launch them, because it just weighs so much. Instead, we can cloak people in shielding. In this case, it was a vest. But as I said, it was an uncrewed mission to Artemis 1. How did you test a vest in this situation?
Yeah, so we had two phantoms, as they're called, or human body mannequins.
Very evocative, phantoms.
Yeah, these are actually widely used in radiation therapy, radiation treatment. They use these for planning out their treatment. Our collaborators at the German Aerospace Center, DLR, they actually launched phantoms to the ISS and strapped them outside of the ISS.
Outside in space?
Yes. Those were called the Matryoshka experiments, named after the Russian nesting dolls. In our experiment, we were using these same Matryoshkas, so that's why we've called it the Matryoshka StemRad radiation experiment. To get back to your question, we had two of them on board Orion during Artemis 1. One of them was named Helga, and the other one was named Zohar. Zohar was wearing the StemRad vest, while Helga remained unshielded.
What are the phantoms made of? When I think mannequin, I think some like hard substance in the window of a store.
These are made out of tissue equivalent resin. The material that they're made of interacts with radiation in the same way that human tissue does. They had several different densities of this resin representing, for example, lung, bone, soft tissue, etc.
Wow. So what is this shielding protecting against in this case? How is this different from what we put on when we get in a dentist chair, or what you might wear if you're working directly with radiation in a lab or at a nuclear power plant?
Most of those sources that you just mentioned have to do with gamma or X-ray radiation, which are photons. For that type of radiation, you want to use typically high atomic number materials. things like lead. Lead is the most common. Tungsten is also good. But for space radiation, it's mostly charged particles rather than photons. These can come from outside of the solar system in the form of galactic cosmic rays. They can also come from the sun, in which case it's mostly protons. This type of radiation actually is best shielded by materials with a lot of hydrogen. There's this formula called the Bethe formula, Bethe, named after the scientist. And that formula describes how effective a shielding material is against charged particle radiation. And the main factor there is the atomic number divided by the atomic mass. If you look at a periodic table, you'll see that hydrogen, it's the only element without any neutrons. Every other element has as many neutrons as it has protons. And as a consequence, this Z over A, atomic number divided by atomic mass factor, is twice as high for hydrogen as it is for any other element.
You can't just use pure hydrogen for various reasons. So you have to go with something that has a few other atoms involved. And in this case, it kind of sounds like a plastic almost.
Yeah. High-density polyethylene is the material with the highest proportion of hydrogen that is safe to work with in space, I'll say.
Is that something we would run into, by the way? Is it around us now?
Yeah, it's the most common plastic. Your water bottles are made out of it, plastic bags.
It's so interesting to think about something so common as being really good shielding from something that's so dangerous. Because like lead, you're like, oh yeah, lead is just, it's like this intense material.
Right.
It's durable plastic. And water also has, as you were going to say, water also has a ton of hydrogen. Is that a weight issue? Why don't we use water vests?
They have a similar density. High-density polyethylene is a little bit less dense, but it actually has a higher proportion of hydrogen than water does. And water has its own problems in terms of if you poke a hole in it, then it can leak out.
In space. Yeah, that's not great. The other thing I want to point out about this protective equipment is that it's a vest. And when I looked on your website you already sell things that do this for workers who work with radiation. And those are actually like belts more. So why is this focus on the upper part of the body or chest cavity rather than the waist and pelvis?
To answer that, first need to give a little bit background on the main innovation here, which is targeted shielding. And that applies to both of the products that you mentioned, the terrestrial application and the space application. So we know that different organs in the body have different sensitivities to radiation. For acute radiation exposure, which is a very high amount of radiation in a given amount of time that can lead to death, in that case, bone marrow is the most sensitive. It is the first organ to fail. And bone marrow is an incredibly regenerative organ. You only need around 2.5% of it to regenerate entirely. So if you can just save that 2.5% of bone marrow, then you should be good, as long as the threshold for radiation exposure doesn't go up into affecting the other organs. And that's a pretty wide range where bone marrow is the only organ that fails. So the idea with that product is that you're selectively shielding the bone marrow, which is in the human body, 50% of it resides in your hips. So it's very effective to shield.
So half of our bone marrow is in there. So if you want to save 2%, that's the best place to shield. Then you don't want to put 100% shielding all over the person either.
Right. And it's really counterintuitive to think about. People often think, what about the rest of my body, right? But it's a cost-benefit analysis, and you get the best benefit for the least amount of weight by shielding that specific area of the body.
And that's for gamma, and that's for land, and that's for this acute radiation sickness. So what did you do differently for space?
For space, the radiation dose is typically not high enough to cause acute radiation exposure if you're inside a spacecraft during a solar storm. If you're on an EVA, if you can't get back inside the spacecraft for whatever reason, you might start to see those exposures that can lead to acute radiation exposure. But inside the spacecraft, the dose will be reduced by maybe a factor of 10. So it's still really high for a single exposure, but it's not going to lead to acute radiation exposures at that point. And at that point, the major risk is increased chance of developing cancer sometime down the road.
So that means you're going to change the targets that you're protecting?
Exactly. The other factor is that in space, you're weightless. It's microgravity or zero gravity. So you're able to use more shielding. So the vest is actually heavier. It weighs around 26 kilograms.
Which for American listeners, it's more than 50 pounds.
Yeah. With that extra weight, we're able to protect the entire torso. That is where most of those cancer-sensitive organs reside, particularly the breasts in women, the lungs, the stomach, the GI tract, and ovaries.
Where all the bad cancers are besides brain cancer.
Right.
And so if these were deployed on a mission with crew, would they wear them all the time?
No, this is an emergency countermeasure specifically meant to be used during solar storms. During solar storms, the radiation exposure can go up by 4 or 5 orders of magnitude over the background of galactic cosmic radiation.
And this affects you even if you are halfway out to Mars, right? It doesn't matter that you're further away from Earth. The Earth is what protects us, like our magnetosphere, from those kinds of events.
Yeah.
Also, I noticed that Artemis 2 had a storm shelter, a so-called storm shelter, where there's a very small shielded area inside the ship where the crew, if they absolutely had to, could all mush themselves into. Is that like equivalent to wearing a vest, or would they wear a vest inside of the little closet they have to get in?
No, the idea wouldn't be to wear the vest inside. That would just make it even more uncomfortable for them. The vest would allow them to leave the storm shelter and perform any activities that they need to perform outside while remaining shielded.
What were the results like from the Phantoms that you sent out in Artemis 1? Did you see an expected level of protection against bombardment up there?
The protection that we saw was actually higher than we were hoping for, better than we were hoping for. I'll start out by saying I could say unfortunately in this case, because there were no people on board, there was no actual solar storm during Artemis 1. That would have been wonderful data, and it would have been the end of the analysis there pretty much. But because there was no solar storm, we were able to use the passage through the Van Allen belts as a surrogate. So the inner Van Allen belt, which are these belts of radiation surrounding the Earth trapped by the magnetic field, the inner one is composed mostly of protons with a similar sort of spectrum you would see during a solar particle event. These are a little bit more energetic, so you can't just take that exposure and say that would be the same amount of protection that you would see during a solar storm. So what we did was we set up a simulation to model the experiment exactly as it occurred, as closely as we could, and validate that simulation against the data that we got from that inner Van Allen belt passage. We saw excellent agreement. It really blew us away. So that simulation was really high fidelity.
And then you can expand on that and say, what if it was, what is it, a Carrington event or something like an enormous ejection event from the sun?
Exactly. So we started out with a little bit more typical solar particle events. We swapped out the Van Allen belt spectrum for the August 1972 and the October 1989 events. The 1972 event was more of a typical large solar particle event, and the 1989 event was more of a harder spectrum, meaning that the protons were more energetic. And for the 1972 event, we saw a around about 60% reduction in radiation exposure due to wearing the vest. And for 1989, it was between around 35 to 40%.
Is that enough to keep the people alive?
These exposure reductions would definitely reduce the risk of cancer. The question isn't whether the astronauts have a risk of dying.
They wouldn't get acute radiation sickness, though?
Not in this case. If there was something like the Carrington event, which you mentioned, that might actually, even inside the spacecraft, that might actually bring you towards acute radiation exposures.
And that's from the 1850s, so it's very unusual to happen.
Yeah, it doesn't happen very often. And if you look back in the ice cores, you can see evidence of events that were even stronger than that thousands of years ago. So it's possible. And these are totally unpredictable, so it could happen tomorrow.
In the case of the two extreme events that you did model, people wouldn't get acute radiation sickness and you reduce their likelihood of getting cancer because they're wearing the vest. If it was something at the very edge here, they could get sick. Is that what you're saying?
It's possible. We modeled an event where we scaled up the exposure to 6 gray. That's the limit of where you start to see gastrointestinal issues. And we modeled the survival of bone marrow at that point. And we saw that without the vest, you'd be below that 2.5% threshold for recovery. But wearing the vest would put you over that hurdle.
So what's next for looking into getting these into space?
What we'd like to do is try to reduce the mass penalty of launching these. They are 26 kilograms. The weight isn't really an issue once you're in space, but launching mass to space is quite expensive. We'd like to try to reduce that cost by using resources that are already in space. To that end, together with our partners at Lockheed Martin, we've been evaluating the possibility of using plastic materials like packaging materials, stuff like that, that is already on board, and using that to fashion a vest once the astronauts are already in space.
Oh, so a little recycling.
Yes.
That's very cool. Thank you, Jordan. This has been really fun to talk about.
Thank you, Sarah. Happy to be here.
Jordan Hoory is the lead scientist for space exploration at StemRad Inc. You can read his Science Advances paper at science.org/podcast. And that concludes this edition of the Science Podcast. If you have any comments or suggestions, write to us at sciencepodcast@aaas.org. To find us on podcasting apps and on YouTube, search for Science Magazine Podcast. Or as always, you can listen on our website, science.org/podcast. This show was edited by me, Sarah Crespi, Megan Cantwell, and Kevin McLean. We had production help from Podigy. Our music is by Jeffrey Cook and Wen Koi Wen. On behalf of Science and its publisher, AAAS, thanks for joining us.
The Viore Core Short moves with you. With everyday versatility and classic athletic fit. It's the one short for everything your day brings. Invest in your happiness and get 20% off your first purchase at viore.com/core20. That's VUORI.com/KORE20. Exclusions apply. Visit the website for full terms and conditions.
You listen to us to hear about new discoveries in science. But did you know we're a part of the American Association for the Advancement of Science? AAAS is a nonprofit publisher and a science society. When you join AAAS, you help support our mission to advance science for the benefit of all. Become a AAAS member at the silver level or above to receive a year's subscription to science and an exclusive gift. Join today by visiting AAAS.org/join. That's AAAS.org/join.